Well, hello and welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2021. We are kicking off the second half of our 24 hours of talks about accessibility and inclusive design. A reminder that you can follow us
and welcome back to Inclusive Design
on Twitter. Our account is ID24Conf, that's CONF. And if you have questions for our presenters coming up now, or indeed anytime through the rest of the conference, you can just use the hashtag ID24. I'm really happy to welcome back someone who spoke at our event last year and has come back today as one of our guest hosts. Welcome, Jokey Camo. It's lovely to have you back. I'll hand over to you for the introductions.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again. Next, we have Robin Spinks and Sonali Rai talking about Auditorial, an innovative approach to inclusive storytelling. It sounds incredibly interesting. So over to you to start, Robin and Sonali.
Thank you very much for the intro, and really good to be here supporting ID24 for what I'm sure will be another great event. So this session is entitled Designing for an Inclusive Web, and this is Auditorial. I'm Robin Spinks, and I work as strategic lead for innovation at the Royal National Institute of Blind People in the UK. And joining me today on the panel or presenter is my lovely colleague Sonali, who is our broadcasting and audio description manager for media and culture. And Sonali is leading the organisation's activity around broadcast media and has got, I think, a great perspective on many of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So every now and again, something comes along which kind of creates, I guess, what can be reflectively referred to as a lighthouse project. And that's very much what I'm going to be talking about today, is something which has had that status for us. So before we do that, it's worth thinking about the fact that there are over 300 million people globally who have a vision impairment. And yet 97% of website homepages do not meet standard accessibility requirements. That's absolutely phenomenal. And I should just clarify before going too much further on that if you look at the World Health Organization website, it will tell you that there are 2.2 billion people with an uncorrectable visual impairment. And it's worth just clarifying why those figures are so different. One figure refers to people with an uncorrectable sight impairment. The larger figure that the WHO mentioned, 2.2 billion, actually refers to people with uncorrected refractive error. So essentially people who don't have access to spectacles. And there was a big decision taken to change the figures. So that just explains the disparity in case you're wondering. So on the screen here, we can see a laptop, and there is a braille display attached to the laptop. In the center, there's a person who's using a CCTV video magnifier. And on the right picture, we can see a gentleman who is using a headset basically to listen to audio of the content that he's consuming. And I guess the thing that kind of unites all of these people is that they're accessing information using perhaps a method of access that might be different to the people that they share a workplace with, or they share a class with, for example, as a student. And they're using a method, a different method to access information than a regular printed word appearing on a page or a web page, for example. So they're all using assistive technology of some kind. And really that was the starting point for this project. We wanted to think about the fact that not everyone consumes information in the same way. And especially thinking about that in relation to storytelling. So storytelling is clearly a very important and very powerful medium for people to be engaging in. And if you're blind or partially sighted, you want to engage in that in the same way that anyone else does. So RNIB is the biggest organisation in the UK, representing the interests of blind and partially sighted people, about 2 million in the UK. And placed on the slide here is an image really of the webpage of the RNIB webpage, See Differently. And down the left-hand side, you'll find information about, for example, sight loss advice, reading, an online shop, etc. And we also have an image of someone who's wearing a Give Me Space wearable face mask. So these are wearables that came into use last year just to try and communicate the fact that many blind and partially sighted people might not be aware whether or not they're observing social distancing. It might just be very difficult or impossible to do that. So one way that you can send out that message is to give a message to others to ask them to give you space. So RNIB got together with Google and The Guardian to really come together in that recognition that everyone accesses information in different ways. And it's largely motivated by our cause around sight loss. So we essentially want people who have a visual impairment to have the opportunity to lead the life that they would like to live. We also want to enable people and to facilitate people to thrive. That's a key word in our strategy for me as a low vision person. On the slide, you can see some examples of sight impairment. So first up, we have macular degeneration. It's the commonest cause of blindness in the Western world. And many of us may know perhaps older relatives or friends or neighbours who have macular degeneration. It's a very gradual onset, and it will typically result in a blurring of vision in the central field of vision. So we can see an example of a landscape there, very beautiful with water underneath it. But we've got this central scotoma, as it's called, this big blob of blurriness in the center of the visual field. Now you can imagine for a moment, if you will, trying to pick up a regular web page on a smartphone, or perhaps you're even picking up, who knows, the luxurious hard copy. Remember those days when people used to read hard copy newspapers? Maybe you're picking up one of those. Imagine looking at the front page of that paper with that type of vision impairment. It's quite easy to imagine how tricky that might be. Moving across, we have photophobia represented. And again, photophobia is a very common side effect of a number of eye conditions, but essentially it refers to a difficulty in coping with bright light and in coping with glare. So that's a condition that I have as part of my condition of albinism, and I would regularly relate to that almost overwhelming brightness within the environment, hence the need to wear sunglasses and perhaps a cap when outdoors. Moving across, we can see blurred vision, and we can also see in that segment a number of other conditions, including cataract, a very common condition where there is often reporting of a milkiness or an opacity of the visual field. So unlike macular degeneration, where you've got every element of the impairment concentrated into the center of the visual field, what happens with cataract is that people very gradually over a period of time begin to notice this opacity, this milkiness, and it makes it very difficult to recognize faces, difficult to read print, difficult to use a mobile device. But it's often, as I say, very gradual, and it's not necessarily always apparent. We have some perhaps less well-known examples of visual impairment, including ghosting, for example, which is down in the center at the bottom. And really, this is where an individual will see an image effectively superimposed over another version of the image. And, picture yourself in a supermarket, for example, navigating the aisles with the intention of purchasing some of your frequently purchased products, but looking at the shelves and seeing that kind of image, that kind of multiple images superimposed over one another. And we can see straight away that would really be quite a tricky thing to do, to get around in our everyday environment. So we wanted to start with that recognition that sight loss affects people in very different ways. And that's critical when we come to think about reading experience, for example. So, screen readers often mispronounce things, the cadence is off, they strip all the humanity out of a sensitive piece of storytelling. That was a contribution from a collaborator who's blind. So he's really talking about the fact that you can't replicate the human voice and the kind of emotion and the sheer compelling nature of human voice. Looking at bright screens gives me headaches. By the end of the day, I feel exhausted and this was a collaborator with photophobia, referring to something that we hear a lot from our community. And really, this is the fact that, for all of us, whether or not we've got a sight impairment, looking at screens for an extended period of time will cause a level of fatigue. And we really want to be thinking about that in terms of how can we reimagine the way that we provide information. Sometimes I have to zoom in so far that the page design breaks. You end up swimming in white space, scrubbing back and forth and losing your place every time. Collaborator with blurred vision. I think that's a highly emotive quote. Sometimes I have to zoom in so far that the page design breaks. You end up swimming in white space, scrubbing back and forth and losing your place every time. So thinking about that, it's incredibly easy to see how someone could become exhausted and fatigued with a simple web page, a simple story. And that, again, informed the way that we thought about this project. So Auditorial is an experiment in storytelling that adapts to suit blind and low vision readers. And really, that's the key word there is adapt. So we wanted to think about the fact that, yes, there are options to consume content in Braille or via audio or perhaps through magnification, often through a combination of those different mediums. But we wanted to think about how could you create content where you were able to make it adapt to the needs of the user, not just to the needs of different users with different user needs, but also taking account of the fact that throughout the day, it's very common for people to experience a change in their vision level, and to actually discover that, it can be more difficult as you go through the day. So really that's the motivation there. Okay, so what we can see here on the next slide is the Silent Spring. So this was Bernie Krause basically talking about in a recording about the environmental destruction on ecosystems through sound. And this is kind of his own account of it. We're able to do that. And we're able to actually have, a description. We have links to this that you can have a listen to as well, that will give you a really good sense of what that experience was like. We wanted to think about how could you take, for example, the opportunity to adjust the settings, to start and play the story, to also allow you to do things like change the contrast sensitivity, enhance the images, for example. So if you had quite a complex foreground and background, how could you do that? How could you reduce motion? And also think about ways in which you could really, in a really agile way, you could change the color palette. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hang on a minute, some of that functionality exists in the operating system, and of course it does. But what if you had the opportunity within the reading experience to actually optimize that very, very quickly without going into settings, and you had the chance to reconfigure that visual and audible experience to suit yourself as you moved through the presentation? That was really our motivation there. Okay, so other multiple formats. Inclusive design is about never assuming that one size fits all. And I think even for those of us working in the industry, it's an incredibly powerful thing for us to remind ourselves of as we go about our work in promoting inclusion. So offering different ways of experiencing information keeps it available for those who may struggle with a particular format. And critically there, it's about being able to actually alter that information on the fly. So, being able to kind of move through a story mode that actually allows you to experience the article, allows you to add, for example, audio to it, and actually enables really us to create a dynamic reading experience, but one which adapts. And perhaps a reader begins a story, gets quite tired halfway through, and wants to quickly adjust the reading experience to suit their preferences. And what we wanted to do was look at how possible is it to do that? What would that involve, and what would the output be like for individuals? So get to know your users is absolutely critical. You'll never design an experience that works perfectly for everyone on the planet. Of that we can be sure. But what you can do is keep the users that you're designing for close to the process. So from conception through the design process, through the writing process, and into development. And of course, this will help you to remove your own bias from the process. We're all very aware of projects that we've perhaps been involved with where accessibility has not been included at the beginning. So there's not an inclusive design philosophy from the start. Someone perhaps gets in touch and says, we've built this website. We'd like you to make sure that it's accessibility compliant. It's all too familiar, isn't it, for many of us? And then, of course, you end up having to retrofit and redesign things, which had they been got right in the first instance, would have saved a lot of time and effort. So it's really about capturing that insight into inclusive design and making that an organic part of the process from the word go throughout every part of development and testing, and then ultimately into the deployment with real world users, and making sure that there's a kind of continuous feedback loop that actually enables us to refine that and to work through various iterations, ensuring that it continues to evolve as we move forward. So at this stage, I would like to welcome on board my colleague Sonali to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Robin. So I'll touch on some of the alternatives that can be considered to enrich the reading experience. So it's important to remember that not all options will be suitable for all types of content or publications. So it's really just food for thought. You know, we think about the audience when we're writing a piece, whether it's a news article or a feature story. We tailor the language to that audience. We write in the language that works for that audience. So similarly, it would be useful to think about some of the alternatives that we explored in the auditorial project, and then choosing the ones that are most suitable for your audience. I mean, there are things that we haven't explored that you may be aware of already. So I'll start with recording an audio version. This could be something as simple as recording your article for it to be read aloud. This would significantly enhance the experience of listening to a story than if it was just simply read out by a screen reader. Quite a few publications and websites, they already support this feature, especially for long reads. An alternative to human speech, obviously, is the screen readers. The problem is screen readers rely on synthetic speech, and we've already heard you can have the words can be mispronounced. You can have, you can mess up the cadence of the writing and flatten the emotion. And that's especially true when it's a sensitive piece of storytelling. You need that intonation, you need that emotion in the voice. On the other hand, a human narrator can deliver the story the way the writer has intended. So it definitely benefits here. The other way could be enriching your audio storytelling. So this is about adding rich audio. You could have interview clips from people who've been quoted in the story. So voice memos to highlight certain case studies, or you could have ambient sounds to build that atmosphere. And if possible, even consider music for greater immersion. These are all great ways to bring users deeper into the context and emotion of the story. But obviously it's worth remembering, and I'm sure most of you listening will be aware of this already, if you're opting for a full cinematic soundscape, ensure that you've got that stripped back narrator only version as well, because there might be blind users who've got sensitive hearing, and just there are a lot of people anyway with sensitive hearing, so that's always useful. The next one is making introductions. So if you end up having interviews of people who are quoted in the story, then don't forget to ask them to introduce themselves. On-screen graphics are often inaccessible for people with severe sight loss, but even those with partial sight loss, they can be quite hard to read. The legibility, the duration for which they stay on the screen, these are all factors that impact that experience. The next one is don't rely on the visual. I mean, that's an obvious one. So the question here to ask is, if you can't see the images or the film, is the context still clear? If there's a video embedded in the story and you can't see, there's a kettle boiling in the video, could the sound be mistaken for something else? Could it be heavy rain? Could it be a train whistling or, an avalanche? Is it clear enough that the sound is coming from a kettle? And if not, you need to consider rewriting the narration or just adding audio description. That's quite straightforward. So for auditorial, we developed what we call holistic audio. So producing your audio in such a way that it explains itself entirely and layering the visual descriptions where necessary. so that it doesn't matter whether you can see the screen or not. It's like an audio drama, just self-explanatory. And there's a simple test. Close your eyes, experience the story. Does it still make sense? If it does, then that's fine. Narrative alt tags. I mean, we all know about alt tags. They're labels written to describe images for assistive technologies. So common accessibility advice is to treat them as succinct labels. But in a storytelling setting, objective labeling of inline imagery, it just obstructs the flow of a screen reader. It adds nothing to the narration. If you want that narrative arc, then just try writing your alt tags into the flow of the article. And it comes in at the exact moment you wish to introduce an image. This could help with writing visual descriptions, that genuinely move your story forward. It explains the story to you. The next one is introduction for screen readers. So adding an introduction for screen readers. So an introductory text for screen reader users can help you give people who can't get a quick visual overview of the site, a better sense of what to expect from a web page. And the last slide before I hand you back to Robin is translating language segments, foreign language segments. So don't rely on subtitles. Consider users who will only be able to experience the story through listening. So make sure you've either dubbed the foreign language segments or the interviews, or you've got a narrative description of what's being said in that interview. Robin, at this point, shall I hand back to you?
Thank you very much, Sonali. So it's also really important to include context in hyperlinks. So navigation can be laborious for people using assistive technologies. So be sure to give people a clear understanding of what to expect if they commit to clicking a link. And I think that's something that we see in many examples of where people perhaps have not expressed that clarity in their design, but really, really important to consider that in terms of the context in hyperlinks. Thank you. So offer alternative colorways. This is a personal favorite of mine. So thinking about color mode and thinking about the impact of color and contrast and background and foreground colors for people with different eye conditions, not just from a standstill perspective, but think about it how it might vary throughout the day as someone is perhaps feeling tired or stressed. So it's about enabling users to change the color of the experience and to make it more comfortable on the eye for those with light or color sensitivities. Black and white, yellow and black, and blue and white are popular go-to combinations, but even introducing one simple dark mode is a game changer for people who struggle with bright screens. I would absolutely second that as someone who lives with albinism and obviously photophobia is part of that. Dark mode, I think I spent several years campaigning with the major platform providers to introduce a dark mode, and had privately celebrated when it arrived on both platforms respectively, because it is an absolute game changer. And it makes everyone else happy on a mobile device, because if you have an OLED screen, it means you use less battery. So dark mode just makes sense. But beyond that, offering the opportunity to select a range of color variations just extends the opportunity to make the reading experience pleasurable and comfortable, which many people, of course, will take for granted, but super important to factor that in. So avoiding color confusion, this is a really interesting one. So people who experience color blindness will struggle to differentiate between problem colors, for example, red and green or blue and yellow. So ensuring that you aren't relying on color alone to convey key information, such as completed or incomplete states within your user interface. And you can see examples of that there. We're not simply relying on color because we've got a button and it's visible that we can see on or off, for example. You've got an example at the top where you can see the word on the button, which it happens to be black and white. And below, you've got an example of green when it's turned on, and presumably grayed out when it's turned off. I couldn't possibly say where that example of a button came from, but we've all seen lots of examples like that. So using the word on and off gives you that context and takes account of people who have color deviation. Also really important to add contrast controls. So being able to affect the contrast levels of imagery can help people who experience low vision to gain a clearer view. It's about being mindful that every image is unique, so there won't be a one-size-fits-all filter that works across every image. And as such, keeping controls easy to access throughout an experience can be helpful. So we can see an example in the picture of a beautiful sunset, and this is an image enhance button, and we're seeing the button move between on and off. And once again, it's really clear what it is that's happening. It's represented in language, and that's actually enabling the contrast controls to be turned on and off. You can see the difference in the sky represented in that. So don't be afraid to go large. So some users have to zoom in to web pages up to 500% plus on a regular basis to check out small details. I'm one of those users, often to the point where the page designs break and become unusable. And this means that they're forever zooming in to see details and then back out to navigate. And that can be very, very tiring and also disconcerting in terms of trying to maintain your place on that particular web page. So the top tips here would be simple layouts break less easily at high zoom. And also, if including small details, giving the user the ability to magnify saves hassle. So grouping key UI together means even if users zoom all the way in, they aren't scrubbing around a negative space looking for controls. So I think that's a really powerful point. As a magnification user, it's something I would experience quite regularly. And you've got an example there on the left-hand side where we can kind of see a control that is demonstrating that as well from a zoom level here. So plus and minus, zooming in and out, and it being very clear what that control actually is. So make the most of focus states. That's another important point here. So focus states are the boxes that appear around each object as a screen reader tabs through a web page. And they're important for helping screen reader users with low vision to know where they are on a page. They need to be clearly visible, but also present an opportunity for creativity. There's no reason why you can't design them in ways that complement your design. Don't be afraid to have fun. I think that was one of the other kind of founding principles in this project was how can we make this playful and fun, but also more informative and more helpful for the user. Add a speed control. So being able to affect the speed of the storytelling can help to make it more comfortable. Blind users that navigate via screen reader often set their readers to high speeds to improve efficiency. And this means that natural speech, while more palatable for synthetic speech, can feel slow by comparison. On the flip side, users who are newly blind and may still be learning to train their attention in a new way via their hearing can find the option to slow the speed down helpful. So just very useful being able to have that. Many people will be familiar with, for example, Audible on a mobile device and having the opportunity to kind of slow down or speed up the audio that they're listening to. And depending on the situation and the context that you're in, that can be a very helpful feature. So again, an example of a control which will benefit people with low vision, but also it will benefit everybody. It's a good demonstration of where there's a universal benefit for everyone. Offer reduced motion. Again, this is the holy grail of web design for visual designers. It's often thought to be whizzy websites with acrobat transitions, but fast-paced transitions and flashing content can cause issues for users with motion sensitivity or epilepsy or degenerative eye conditions, often something that's overlooked. So plan a static version of your website alongside the more adventurous experience so that users who require reduced motion also have a quality experience. And once again, I would mention that that's something that you have controls for on mobile inside the OS, so kind of reducing motion. So we're thinking about how do you build upon that to actually give a control that kind of helps someone to optimize a particular experience that you happen to be in. It's also really important to select highly legible fonts. And really in terms of this, sans serif fonts are generally easier to read for people with low vision. So Arial, Helvetica, Calibri, Century Gothic, Tahoma, and Verdana are all recommended by the RNIB, but even sans serif fonts aren't perfect. Many have got letters with similar forms that get confused by those who can only see part of the word or who have blurred vision. For auditorial, we used high legibility fonts with distinct letter forms, Inter for platform UI and Guardian text, sans for editorial. And where possible, avoid block capitals, italics, underlining, or breaking lines with hyphens, as these can all interrupt the reading flow. So just thinking about something again that is a very simple consideration, but overlooking it essentially does make it much more difficult for many readers to engage in the most optimal way with the reading experience. So using binaural, this is interesting. So binaural sound can enhance the excitement of storytelling for audiences reliant on audio. And if you haven't tried this out, it would be really useful to take a look at a binaural experience. Consider creating an opportunity within your story for a 360-degree oral space, a busy city street, a rainforest, that's a personal favorite, and position objects from the storytelling below them on the floor, above them in the tree canopies, or moving around them as the story unfolds. Used sparingly, extended periods can cause dizziness. So it's thinking again creatively and imaginatively about how we can use binaural to enhance the experience. Think about the experience and the emotion that you're trying to convey. And I guess asking the question, where would that really add value? How would it bring the user into the tent, into the story that's happening, make them feel like they're part of the story, they're experiencing it in a whole new way. And I think binaural audio has got a really powerful role in helping people to do just that. So watch ableist language, something that's super important for us to be thinking about. So avoid terminology that assumes disability is a negative experience to avoid stigmatizing. And it's kind of very, very easy for us all to kind of, fall foul of that in the writing that we do. And I think it's a really important self-reflection to be going through that and thinking about how we can avoid that. Be mindful of, falling back on ableist idioms like falling on deaf ears or turn a blind eye. Avoid instructional language like see, look, or watch, where not all users will be able to do that. And then when describing people with disabilities, define them as people, not through their disability. So even simple shifts from the blind to people who are blind show much more respect. And note our intentional use of preferences instead of disabilities/abilities in the settings copy on the left to avoid stigmatizing people as being outside of the norm. And that's a super important point. People with disabilities are inside the norm. They're part of the norm. When telling stories about individuals, work with them to make sure that you're portraying their truth their way. And an example on the left there is this storytelling experience can be adapted to suit your preferences using the settings panel and then a little adjust settings icon. So thinking more and more about preferences rather than, traditionally an accessibility menu. People with disabilities are just part of the norm. They're not other, I think we'd all agree with that. So adding feedback is super important. So simple feedback such as button noises or button voicing or haptic feedback helps blind users to know that they've made a selection correctly. And anything that lets you know that you've hit the button is okay, is like, boom, you've got it. Or for example, an ear con that's played when you hit a button. A simple toggle that enables users to turn button sounds on and off means that they're there for those who need them, but they're uninvasive for those who don't. So we can see on the left-hand side, we've got button sounds, and we've got none, which has got a strike through. And then on the right, we've got a sounds icon, which if we tap that, it would change and just give us a very definite sense of what we were going to expect in that particular reading experience. So plan a linear version. So assistive technologies rely on a linear step-by-step path through the experience. Visual designers get excited about websites with fresh, unusual design styles and unconventional navigational structures that enable users to explore in multiple directions, choose their own adventure, or linger and explore spaces at their own pace. If you're planning an adventurous digital experience, make sure that you also plan clear linear paths for assistive technology users. And there's an example of that on there on the left-hand side of the slide. So planning a clear linear experience is really important. To talk now about some useful tools.
Thanks, Robin.
This is where I hand back to Sonali. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. So Robin has spoken to us about the different features that you can use and the different alternative formats that you can offer. I'll be very quickly taking you through some of the tools that you can use to test the accessibility of a web page. I'm sure everyone here has you have your own favorites. Now, if you visit the Auditorial project website, along with the prototype of the storytelling platform, the team has listed a few tools that could be used to test the accessibility of the design. The very first one, the first one is the built-in screen reader in the Chrome browser. So you can find it under Edit, Speech, and Start Speaking. This will enable you to check what your website is like for screen reader users. So you get that feedback and you understand, okay, whether the layout is working or not. The second one is Totally. It's an accessibility visualization tool. It's been built by the Khan Academy using some of Google's Chrome accessibility developer tools. So Totally enables you to add a little panel with the glosses to any web window. You can play around with the toolbar, check your designs, and it will flag which parts of the web page are failing accessibility guidelines. And then it makes suggestions on what are the things that you can do to correct those failures. The next one is Who Can Use. And Who Can Use is a free website that lets you plug in Pantone numbers to check the color combination, make sure that the color palettes you're using are high contrast enough. And you can try the different combinations. The next one is Stock. So Stock is a free plugin for XD, Sketch, Figma, or Google Chrome, and it includes a color contrast checker and has a color blindness simulation. So these were just some of the ones that you can try. We've got a longer list on the Auditorial website. Now, before I hand you back to Robin for the final wrap-up, I'll read out 3 comments that we gathered during the feedback sessions for Auditorial. The first one that I've got is from a collaborator with partial sight loss, who said, I wish I could have these controls on every website across the web. So this was part of the final feedback session. A collaborator who's blind said, having the story told in this form was so much nicer than having to listen to my screen reader ramble through it. And the last comment is, again, from a collaborator with partial sight loss. This was easier to access than anything on a traditional news website or app. This actually gave me control over my experience. Now, these are just 3 people. It might be that the experience doesn't work for certain people. There is no tick box, that works for everyone. But offering alternatives is generally, it makes it easier for a lot of people to access content in the way they would prefer to access content. Robin, at this point, I'll hand back to you, and thanks very much, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Sonali. So yes, I mean, in summary, we're really looking at a lighthouse project here, which aims to take not just standards that exist and conventions and good practice, but begins to say, what would it look like if we went beyond that and tried some innovative approaches that allowed people to go further? You know, and the question would be, what is the ultimate in customizable experiences that also allow simplicity, straightforward engagement, immersion, and above all else, enjoyment of storytelling? And you know, if you imagine someone who is fully sighted, for example, reading a story, and imagine every possible emotion that they could have and every possible feeling that they could have whilst they're actually reading with their sight a story. How can you take as much of that as possible and make it as easily available to people who have sight problems in the reading experience? And that, I guess, in a nutshell, is what we wanted to try and do. It's by no means the end of the project. It's really the start of it. So Auditorial was intended to provoke conversation and discussion, try out approaches, get feedback from users who've been involved in a really central way throughout the whole project, but also to say, what next? Where do we go next in terms of storytelling and reading experiences? How can we create the ultimate reading experience? And that's a goal that I continue to work towards, as does Sonali and other teams in RNIB, and of course, teams working in the sector as a whole. How can we create the ultimate reading experience with the ultimate level of customization that works for the largest number of users, and really bring that engagement, that immersion, that incredible feeling of enjoyment that's possible from stories, and make that available to as many people as possible. So thank you so much for your participation today. Thank you for listening, and we'd be delighted to turn the floor over to questions.
Sonali and Robin, thank you so much. As a screen reader user and huge reading fan, I was just jumping up and down here. All the things. Thank you for sharing your insights with us all. Jackie, I know we've got lots of questions. Where do you want to kick it off?
We'll start with one from Twitter. They say, when selecting which sounds to use for stories using Auditorial, how did you decide which sounds would be more holistic?
I think I can take that one. I think this was really the team working with blind and partially sighted individuals who were at RNIB, but also inside Google and some others, really to try and get a sense of what would enable someone to have the greatest sense of meaning from an experience or from a situation. So if audio were being used, what would make that a compelling listen? What would be kind of unquestionable as an audio source or representation? You know, where would there be ambiguity, and how could we avoid that? So it was a process of elimination, going through options with individuals, and really trying to create something where there's a goodness of fit, but there's also that sense of moving beyond the traditional experience.
Just to add to that, Robin, I think you really have to understand what you're trying to communicate. So because this was a nature piece, we wanted to make sure that there were sounds of nature and you were immersed in that space. So that's how we went about selecting the right sounds. And Robin is absolutely right. I mean, it did go through a number of different panels. But for any other story, you just need to look at your story, try and understand the atmosphere and then the narration that you're trying to communicate, and that will lead you to the sounds that you want to pick on.
You know, what exactly? You know, what would being there actually feel like? What would be the thoughts and feelings and emotions that you might have if you were there, and how can we reflect that?
Hey, this is a question for Sonali. What are your thoughts about audio descriptions that offer more information than if available visually? For example, the names of characters long before they're mentioned in the original content.
I think this is one of the most asked questions. So you're preempting information almost. I think So best practice is not to take names, not to mention any information before they're actually mentioned in the asset, the creative asset. But quite often you have to take a creative decision. So if there is no space, and you know the name is going to be crucial because someone else is going to be naming the person and saying what he's done, you need to preempt that information. So it really depends on the asset, how much information you have to deliver before the crucial thing happens. Now, this is obviously more important when you're talking about fictional content. In non-fiction content, I think you can take sort of, again, it's probably best that if you hold back, but preempting information in fictional content, I think it's just a necessity of the hour, maybe. Definitely not best practice, I would repeat myself.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We have 3 more. You talked about altering information on the fly. Would you say that maybe it's better for designers and developers to somehow stick to the same information architecture? If there are so many people who have trouble with eyesight, should we at least try to keep the same flow on each web page instead of putting it on the person who needs the aid?
I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And really, that was part of the motivation around this project, was really to try and find a level where you can have that controlled consistently and have a consistent approach to it. But where's the point at which you create additional levels of refinement and control, and what could those look like? So, it's a great question, because absolutely, if you make too much functionality, it becomes confusing for users and it becomes bewildering and potentially off-putting. So essentially that is part of the quest, really, is how do you achieve the right balance in that to make it work for users in the best possible way. And I think what the project has done is it's begun to push that dialogue to the next level with users and create feedback. And I think we're seeing users who are looking for more refinement, more customization than typically the platform allows. But then you will also speak to people who want quite simply the most basic experience that's possible. It's about recognizing that every user is different and giving people the opportunity to have a level of control over the content that works for them, and make that quietly dormant in the background. But when they require it, the functionality can come alive for them. That's really the challenge.
Okay, next question. There was a portion of the presentation that talked about getting to know your users. How do you know when you've tested your product with enough people who struggle with eyesight, since there are, if I remember correctly, 6 to 8 different types?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So I think you can never do enough testing. I think that would be one of the things that we would talk about with many people, is that you need to be constantly testing and checking with users. What you do begin to recognize after a certain amount of testing is that you can see a pattern in the feedback from users, and you begin to see feedback emerging into certain categories. You begin to see levels of consistency. And you begin to integrate that into your workflow. Having said that, I think it's also true that you will come across people who've got perhaps quite an unusual eye condition. So, you saw the example at the top of the presentation where someone might see, for example, 9 or 10 different images of something fused on top of one another. Now, that's a relatively rare example, but you might find someone with a condition which manifests in fairly unusual and less common impacts, that would need to be integrated. And I think, what we're not saying is that we will create a solution for every single type of sight loss. That's simply impossible to do. But what we can do is to test and pilot solutions that speak to the majority of concerns that people will raise, and do that in a way that extends functionality beyond what is typically available. So it's a to summarize that, it's a constant challenge. I don't think there is a perfect answer to it. And really through the project, what we wanted to do was find out how we could move that dialogue forward and create some representations that would be useful for learning for designers and storytellers in the future.
That's really great. Thank you, Robin and Sonali. We are just about on time, I'm afraid. So we're going to have to leave it there. To everyone who's tuned in, please consider heading over to YouTube and hitting the like button to show your appreciation. And while you're there on our channel, youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24, why not subscribe, and you'll get notifications about everything that comes up. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is a respectful community, and you'll find our code of conduct linked from the footer of our website. Of course, ID24 would not be possible without the generous support of all our supporters: Intopia, Fable, TPGI, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intuit, Infoaxia, the Center for Inclusive Design, Web Directions AAA Conference, Adrian Rosselli LLC, and Can Access. Thank you to all of them. Jyogi and I will be back in a little under 10 minutes on the hour with our next talk. So we will see you very soon.